Okay, so the next page that you're going to be making, which is page 15, is plot structure. I didn't provide an actual title, so you're going to want to write plot structure at the top. And you've already cut it out, so you have two pieces. You have, again, this piece with the notes, and then you have this piece with the 5 elements of plot. We are going to actually glue these down kind of staggered. I want the note ones to stick out, kind of like a turned picket fence. So we are going to start with the notes, but when we glue it down, we're going to glue it off to the right a little bit. So I'm just going to take my glue and go just generally around the shape with the frame. Again, it doesn't take much glue. I hope we all know that by now. I'm going to glue it a little further up because we are going to draw something at the bottom of the page. But so here is the notes portion of the page. And then this one, your main job is, I don't want it all the way over. I don't want it hiding the notes. We're going to slide it over to the left so you can see the notes underneath. Your main job is just to line it up top and bottom. So I'm going to do the same thing, except I'm only going to glue on this tab. So I'm going to put a little bit of glue on this tab. And again, my main job, line it up top and bottom, but leave a little bit of room so the notes stick out. And again, I'm going to turn it and just take my scissor and cut up each kind of arrow here so we can lift each flap separately. I actually find it easier to do this once I've glued it down. If you cut the flaps ahead of time, it kind of gets a little flimsy. So now we're going to go through each element of plot. So we have our exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. These small lines here actually add up to plot structure. We're going to draw it at the end, and it's going to look kind of like a mountain or a roller coaster, but we'll draw it at the end. So the first part of a plot, every story has a plot. It all has an exposition. Exposition is another it's a fancy word for beginning. So I'm going to take my red. In the exposition, we find out all kind of the information we need to know. We find out about the setting, find about the characters, who our narrator is, what the point of view is, and then we also find out about kind of the mood of the story. Is the story going to be mysterious? Is it going to be humorous? We kind of find out the mood of the story at that same time. Inside the exposition is something called the inciting incident. I'll say that again. It's called the inciting incident. This is an event that when it happens, it kind of propels the story forward. If you didn't have this event or incident, the story would never really take off. You have to have that event that's like, oh, here we go. Things are going to start happening. That kind of also signals the end of the exposition and the beginning of the rising action. So I'm going to switch to my orange. This is where the story starts to build. I'm sure if you've been on a roller coaster and you're in the cart and you're in the chick, chick, chick as you go up the roller coaster and you know something big is going to happen when you get to the top, that's where we're at. We are slowly building the story to that big moment. So the rising action, this is the main part of the story. It typically takes up probably 50% of the book. This is where conflicts arise. The character runs into problems, things don't go right, there's issues. This is where the story goes up. It leads to the climax. And the closer you get to the climax, the kind of, you get a little like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? All of those events are the rising action. Then we get to that moment, the climax. It is represented by a peak because it is the point of the story with the most excitement. So it's a turning point. things are going to happen for the character. Everything's going to change from this point on. It's the point of highest excitement. This is where our protagonist comes face to face with the conflict, and they have to figure out a way through it. They have to make a decision. What am I going to do? I either have to beat the bad guy, figure it out. The character has to make a decision. This is that, we also sometimes call it the OMG moment, because it's the moment in the book where you as the reader are just like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? That's the climax. After the climax, the action starts to fall. It starts to come down. That's why it's represented with a line coming down. This is where the author ties up all the loose ends. And typically, if there's been any conflicts between characters, they get resolved. They get figured out, solved. This is where usually you as the reader are like, oh, good. It's all getting figured out. This character is now happy. Things start to figure out. It's kind of a nice spot in the book because you start to see, after all this reading, things start to pan out. And then finally, as the book comes to a close, this is called the resolution. It's called the resolution because the root word is resolve. And when something gets resolved, it gets figured out. So this is where the story comes to a close. It's a fancy word for the end of the story. So this is the end of the story. Now, not all books end with a perfect resolution. Some have a closed ending. The story is complete. You know what happens to all the characters. The book is done. You shut it. You're satisfied. Some books have an open ending. The author, I actually do not like these, but the author leaves a few things undone. And you as the reader have to be like, I wonder what happened. And then, of course, there's those awesome cliffhangers. A really abrupt ending that keeps the reader wanting more. Usually followed by a what? Another book in the series, a sequel. So there's our 5 elements of plot. Now, if we add them all up, so let's draw, here's our exposition. It's kind of a flat line, goes up just a little bit. Then we add our rising action, which is our orange. At the very top, we end up, this is hard to see because it's yellow, but we end up with this peak or the climax. After the climax, the action falls. There's your falling action. And then finally, we have the resolution. So all of these pieces add up to this kind of mountain shape that all stories follow. That's your plot structure.